committee members for Fabulous Friday, and we want to welcome you all to our program today. But first, as usual, we have some announcements. Okay. Donations received from the December 5th Give Where You Live event will go towards public programming, including bringing in traveling exhibits, rotating displays, special events, and educational opportunities, unless otherwise noted. So on December 5th, it's also open house at the Family History Center, with members receiving 35% off in the gift shop. So please remember us on Give Where You Live Day. Okay, and then as you can tell, we're getting ready for our annual Christmas tree walk. So if anybody would like to take a wreath home with you and decorate it and bring it back, talk to the girls on your way out. The members only preview will be Saturday, December 7th from noon to 1 with this year's theme, Mapping Buffalo County. If you're not yet a member, join. Membership is open to everybody. Follow us on Facebook, which is Buffalo County Historical Society. Continue to visit the website for additional information, which is www.bchs.us. Okay. Then, today, we are privileged to have Dr. Nathan High join us, and he's talking about the immortal Buffalo County World War I casualties. Go for it, Dr. Tom.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're gonna have a fun conversation today on a very solemn topic, appropriate for the weekend before Veterans Day, right? For those of us who might not remember that the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour is when the First World War ended, which is why we celebrate Armistice Day, for those of you who would remember when it was called Armistice Day. I want to thank the Trails and Rails Museum, Buffalo County Historical Society, the Fabulous Friday Committee, as always, for organizing wonderful events and letting me pull things out of the back. And also, we also have some stuff that was brought in from the Gibbon Heritage Center that we'll talk about. But before we begin on any of this, I want to just do a short kind of contextualization, as any good historian would want to do, on what Nebraska looked like in 1917, kind of on the outset of the war. For those who kind of remember their World War I history, beginning in 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain of events that resulted in years of bloody trench warfare in Europe, both along the Western Front and the Eastern Front with the Russian forces and the German forces. And America watched what was going on, the development of trench warfare, of industrial carnage on a scale previously unmanageable. We have here a British Mark IV tank that has collapsed into a German trench in 1917, and the use of long-range artillery. This looks like a photograph of the moon, but it's actually a French village. You can see the villages up here, and just the pockmarks across the landscape, which is still very much part of the former battlefields today. If any of you've ever spent any time on World War I battlefields that are now farms in France and Belgium and elsewhere, usually kind of in the spring as folks are tilling, they'll set aside all the ordnance that they find at the corner of their field. And then the local bomb squads come and collect it. So very much still part of the lived environment. And folks in Nebraska are watching this. They're seeing this. This is John Singer Sargent's famous painting Gassed, which is at the Imperial War Museum in London. This painting is an enormous painting. John Singer Sargent is an American-born British painter, and this painting's life-size. And was brought actually to the United States for the centennial commemorations, was in Kansas City in 2019. But the scale of the destruction and the use of new weapons, chemical weapons, in particular, as seen here, were haunting and startling to people in the United States. That this is not something we want to get involved in, right? But we tried to stay out. We do have the supervisor for the George Norris House with us, so I had to include a little bit of George in here. But our most famous Senator George Norris tried to keep the United States out of the First World War. In the spring of 1917, Woodrow Wilson had put forward a policy to arm merchant ships. Merchant ships were being sunk by German U-boats, and it was this idea that we needed to defend American shipping and American commerce amid unrestricted submarine warfare. George Norris saw this as an illegal authorization of the United States entrance into the war. That if we suddenly start arming merchant ships, that means merchant ships are going to start firing on German ships, which is going to bring the United States directly into the war. And in this time period, the policy for U.S. war policy, that there's no War Powers Act yet that we're going to see in the Vietnam War. And so any military action has to be authorized by Congress. And so this was seen as executive overreach, and so George Norris and a number of other progressive Republicans kind of lead an effort to halt, and ultimately are successful in halting the passage of the Armed Merchant Ship Bill in March 1917. That session of Congress is then closed, and immediately a new session is called, and there had been an election, midterm election, and so the new Congress stepped in and passed it. So it was a moral stand, but it wasn't ultimately a successful effort. And George Norris, deeply concerned about how the residents of Nebraska would feel about him taking this stand, rejecting the recently re-elected president on this policy, took the midnight train back to Nebraska and actually sent a telegram to the head of the state GOP and said, I want a special election, I'm going to resign. I want the people of Nebraska to be able to respond to me taking this position. And so he tells us in some of his writings that he got to Lincoln and he asked his local chief of staff to rent out the largest lecture hall that he could find. And it happened to be the Opera House across the street from the hotel. And George assumed he was going to go in there and either nobody was going to show up or he was going to get screamed at by his constituents for rejecting the president and doing this. And so he walks into this hall and everybody is ecstatic. They are happy that he has rejected the president's policy and that he has tried to keep the state of Nebraska out of the war. And so then he continues his little speaking tour. He goes to Holdridge, and then he goes home to McCook, and also in each of the communities renting out the biggest hall he can, and then hearing from his constituents on his war policy. But the tenor of things are going to change very, very quickly. This is March 1917. In April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson asks for a declaration of war in a joint session of Congress, which is depicted here, which he does receive and George Norris does support. And Norris will be a supporter of the war effort then for the duration of the war, and then he will continue to serve as the senior Nebraska senator until 1943. So long tenure, but kind of giving us a sense of where the state is at before the declaration of war. The folks around here, they don't want their sons to die for an archduke. They don't want to die in a war against the German Empire, against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is so far and away from the daily concerns of the residents around here. But with the declaration of war, the tenor really begins to change. This is the front page of the Kearney Hub on the day the war is declared, and you can see they're giving like almost hourly updates. This is like by 3 p.m. They've got the text of the war resolution and a lot of different kinds of new concerns are being raised by the war. This is the Gibbon paper. This is not on the front page of the Gibbon paper. This is actually on like page 5 of the Gibbon Reporter. More likely than not, they'd already had the typeset by the time the war announcement came, and so they fit it in the middle. Whereas then, for the Umkrieg paper, they don't even have an issue for the announcement of the war, because it's a weekly paper, and so the war's already been announced, everybody knows that, and so they just have small updates on the war bulletin about what is going on with different policy. And so you're going to see a lot of close coverage in the local press, and you're going to be seeing kind of amplification of U.S. support and efforts to get folks to enlist and participate and support the war effort. So we get to the point then by the summer of 1917. This is a letter that Willa Cather actually writes to her editor. She's back in Red Cloud. And she writes him, I'm now at home and will let you know when I flit away to Wyoming, Nebraska is bubbling hot for war. So that there's been a shift just in a couple of months. That now that the United States is involved, that there's going to be a sustained need that we are going to have to, we're in this for the long haul, we need to participate. It still is unpopular in some quarters and will remain so for the 16 months that we're involved. But in May of 1918, the United States also then passes the Selective Service Act, which a great many of us in this room have had to sign up for, and still will have to sign up for whenever you turn 18. And so young men are being called up and drafted into units beginning in May. And each county has an allotment of how many eligible men within the right age group are going to be called up. And one of the things that I brought out of the back, it's a little fragile, so after, please come up. This is the first 5% of the draftees from Buffalo County. So Buffalo County will have 601 men who are draft eligible, and 146 of them will have to go serve to meet the allotment for the county. And the first are going to go fairly early in the summer, and then the last are going to be in the spring of 18. And these young men here, they're actually standing outside the train station in downtown Kearney, more likely than not preparing to go to the front. And a great many of the men who enlist or who are drafted end up serving in the 89th Division, which one of the strange treasures we have here at the museum. This is a World War I helmet from the 89th Division. This is the insignia for the 89th Division, so we know it's more likely than not from a local soldier. But this was left at the back door like 2 years ago, and Brock found it. We don't actually know. There's no donation paperwork with it. We don't know whose it is. Nothing like that. But we do know, just because of the insignia on it, that more likely than not it is a local soldier. So if anybody knows anybody who's missing a World War I helmet, please let us know. We would really like to have a little more information. This photo includes a number of Nebraska men. There are assuredly probably men from Buffalo County in this photo, but I do know for sure this does contain men from Dawson County because my great-grandfather's in that photo. And so it's a lot of young men who after their training, they're going to be shipped over fairly quickly in the summer of 1917. Nebraska is going to send 50,000 soldiers to serve in the First World War. That is a significant amount and a significant contribution. We have 7,000 sailors, which is also impressive. We're not exactly a maritime state. So you don't have a lot of folks who are well-equipped to go fight on the high seas. 550 Marines and 400 nurses. And that includes nurses also from the local community here in Buffalo County. Buffalo County has approximately 700 soldiers with some sort of tie to the county. One of the things that is you kind of look at the story of the First World War in Buffalo County, and this is also actually true of the Second World War, folks move. Folks might spend part of their childhood here, they might move somewhere else. So some of the men that Buffalo County will claim as being a casualty or as being one of the soldiers who died hadn't actually lived in Buffalo County for quite some time. So one of the soldiers I'm actually going to show you, Scotts Bluff, claims as their first casualty, but Buffalo County also claims him as their first casualty. 22 Buffalo County soldiers will die during the First World War, the vast majority from illness and disease. Combat deaths are actually, there are a number of combat deaths, which we're going to talk about, but most of the soldiers, the Spanish influenza also happens in this time period, and you also have a lot of young men be put into cramped quarters very, very quickly. And so you have other kind of communicable diseases that are moving through camps fairly, very swiftly. Now, what we know now about the impact of combat on soldiers, and particularly soldiers returning. We know we have records of soldiers who returned with physical wounds. We know soldiers who lost limbs or were shot or injured in a variety of different capacities. We don't have a lot of documentation on the psychological toll that the First World War took on these men. In this time period, what we would now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder was known as shell shock. And a great many men are returning They've been sitting in a trench, bullets flying overhead, the specter of death, in a flooded trench filled with rats, a comrade whose body is built into the wall of the trench. You hear the wounded out in no man's land. It can be taxing, to say the least. And there are early treatment plans for some of these men. In a great many cases, officers are given kind of a respite, and they're sent to country homes throughout the United Kingdom to get restored. Whereas enlisted men are given cruder methods like electroshock therapy to get them to talk. One of the common features of shell shock in this time period is men just shut down and refuse to talk. We can get some sense in individual cases, assuredly. Young men who might struggle to keep a job when they come back, young men who might struggle with addiction when they come back, suicide, unfortunately, among some of those who returned, but that is really granular research and difficult to tie necessarily directly back to their wartime experience. But I will kind of show you, we do have quite a bit of documentation on one soldier who has some issues when he returns, which we'll talk about. For UNK, we have 400 students and alumni who participate in the war in some capacity, which again, very, very small institution at the time period. There's only 45 faculty and about a little over 1,000 students. So again, a significant number of young men. Most of the eligible men at the university during this time period either sign up for the draft, I mean they have to, it's the Elective Service Act, or enlist or participate in the National Guard or support the war in some capacity, which we'll see. Of the men who serve in the war, 3 do die and 1 in combat, which is one of the stories we're going to talk about today. When the soldiers returned, they sought support from one another. And so the American Legion Post here in Kearney was founded after the First World War, as was the Legion Post in Gibbon, which is one of the artifacts that Kevin brought in. Is we have a photo of Bradley Buck, who is the namesake of the Legion Post in Gibbon, who we will also see. And these are all men who participated in the war from Buffalo County in some capacity. A lot of the stories I'm going to be telling come from a great many different places, but if you want to learn more, there actually is an entire book on Buffalo County in the First World War. It's in the World War, Buffalo County. We have a number of copies in the back. The public library still has copies. We have 6 copies at the university, but it was produced after the war, and it documents everybody who wanted to be documented and their participation in the war. And it talks a great deal about other local efforts in the community, the Red Cross, the draft board, the Home Guards, and other units, and other folks who participated. We have a lot from the period that kind of shows how the local communities, the communities in Buffalo County, are supporting soldiers and contributing to the war effort. This is Kearney's service flag. Which it's difficult to see, but it's something that we would be familiar with. There would be blue and gold stars for all of the participants, all of the men serving overseas. And as far as I know, that this flag has not survived. I believe Gibbon has theirs at the Heritage Center, but ours, I think it's on the wall.
Trying to think which conflict that's for.
Yeah, but demonstrating, again, the substantial commitment. This is actually from a parade in downtown Kearney. We also have, this is a photo of the living service flag. This was for the 170 students at UNK, at Kearney Normal, who are participating, and so they have 170 young female students who are marching, kind of representing all of those. And then this is also in downtown Kearney here as well. And it wasn't just in events like this. This is from the Gibbon paper, the Gibbon Reporter. There's a regular list that is being published in most of the papers across the county, listing local boys who are in the service, and oftentimes giving updates, as we see here, Bradley Buck, the first casualty, and then Brian Comstock, and then the other men who are in the service. And this will be, again, reporting coming in from the front as this changes. But one of the things you also see is it takes some time for families to get notified, for the news to get back, and there's a great many cases where folks are not finding out for 3, 4, 5 months about the status of their loved ones. And everybody's doing their part. These are all the Civil War veterans in Kearney, and they bought an ambulance to send to France. This is Centric Post number 1. These are all the GAR members, and they're actually standing outside the old courthouse, which is interesting to think about, that men who fought on horses with single-shot rifles are contributing an internal combustion vehicle to go over the Atlantic Ocean to go fight in a war. These men, I mean, the Civil War has been past, 50, 60 years at this point. The world has changed quite significantly, but they deeply understand that they also have to do their part. So we see veterans supporting future veterans in this conflict. And you see other aspects of the conflict. This is a site that will be familiar to a great many of you. This is Copeland Hall at the UNK campus. This is where my office is at, and I spend what time I'm not down here, that's where I am. This is the barracks for the Student Army Training Corps, which is the kind of predecessor for ROTC. And so in the fall of 1918, what is then the gymnasium gets converted to the barracks for the officers, the young students who want to have additional training. And we have documented descriptions of them having live fire drills and other things on the lawn in front of Copeland Hall but it's a very short-lived, the Student Army Training Corps starts in October and then the war ends in November. So it's not a very long conflict, or a program that is in operation for the conflict. And we also get a sense of what's going on because the soldiers tell us, because families are publishing their letters in the local paper. One of the things that is very, very frequent during this time period, because news is so slow in coming, that folks are sharing the letters that they are getting from loved ones with the local paper. So this is from the Gibbon Reporter. Herbert Danner is writing from somewhere in France to his father, but also mail is censored during the First World War. There's official censors that are going through. So all the letters typically just say somewhere in France. And they don't necessarily always talk a lot about what's going on, which isn't the case of this. I cannot tell you a great deal now about this country, but when I get back home, I will fill you full of war news. There's also concern you don't want to scare your parents. You don't want to let them know what's going on. You're not going to describe the rats in the trenches or the mustard gas to mom back at home. But we do, again, get a sense of what's going on. But as you see, this letter appears a month after it was sent. So it took it a while to get across the Atlantic. It took it a while to get into the hands of the Gibbon Reporter. And actually all of this, there's about 4 letters that are in the 3 columns in the Gibbon Reporter. What also is happening during the First World War as part of the effort to get people to support the war is painting Germans as the enemy. And not just the German High Command, that is what Woodrow Wilson had said. He wanted to be very, very clear. He's like, we're fighting the German political system, we're fighting the German High Command, we're not fighting Germans in and of themselves. Which is a great concern, locally, because Nebraska has very large German populations, right? A great many of us are probably descendants from German immigrants, myself included. But in the process of amplifying anti-German rhetoric, you have violence being directed at Germans throughout central Nebraska. That German businesses, this is up in Amherst, a store and a church are both vandalized, and what the common feature is yellow paint is being thrown on things as a sign of cowardice. There are also accounts in Grand Island, the homes of 2 married men, because they would refuse to, they weren't able to serve, they were married, and were excluded from the draft, but they were deemed cowards by their community. In this case, it was a German business and a German church, because a great many parishes throughout the area still had German language services. We still had, first and second generation German immigrants, so it's Catholic churches, it's Lutheran churches, German Baptist churches. We have a German Baptist church on our grounds. And there are folks in the community who try to get them to stop doing this. And so here in Kearney, the local Council of Defense, which is a kind of a war support organization, unilaterally opposes mob violence and the use of yellow paint. So there are folks in the community participating in the war effort who really want this to stop. Now, the folks who serve in the war, Kearney or Buffalo County has a great number of people who serve in the conflict, and Quansu Lee is one of the more interesting individuals. He is the first casualty of the First World War in Buffalo County. He dies in the summer of 1917, in June of 1917. This is a picture of Quansu Lee on the Mexican border. He is a member of the Nebraska National Guard. He's also from Korea. Quansu Lee was born in what is now North Korea, near Pyongyang, and arrived in the United States with two friends, Henry Chung and Il-Han Nu. And these men are immigrating to the United States. They want education. They've been supported by local missionaries, by largely Presbyterian missionaries, and are spending initially time in California, spend time in Denver, and then settle in the bustling metropolis of Kearney, Nebraska. Quansu Lee, Il-Han Nu, and Henry Chung all attend Kearney High. They learn English, they spend time in the local community, that they live with local host families. Il-Han will go on, he'll be the center for the Kearney High football team in 1912. He'll graduate from Hastings High School, and then become the first Korean graduate at the University of Michigan, and then co-found La Choy Foods, which some of you might see at the grocery store. Henry Chung will graduate from Kearney High, then he'll go to the normal school, graduate class of 1915, eventually receive his PhD from Northwestern, and then become the chief of staff to Syngman Rhee, who the first president of South Korea. Quansu Lee's story does not continue after 1917. He attends Kearney High, graduates from Kearney High, joins the Nebraska National Guard, and serves on the Mexican border during the Mexican Border Service. So after Pancho Villa raids Columbus, New Mexico, the National Guard is called up to the border to prevent further incursions amid the Mexican Revolution, which is where this picture was taken, and this is from our archive here. With the calling up of troops for the First World War, he is mobilized and deployed to North Platte. There's significant concern that there are German saboteurs who will try to destroy key infrastructure points in the United States, and the Union Pacific would be one of those. And in the course of those duties, while he's guarding a bridge over the Platte River, he drowns. There is some speculation that he might have been murdered by some of his fellow soldiers, although that is not clear in surviving materials. He has no next of kin, and so when he dies, he's buried at the cemetery at Offutt Air Force Base, where he remains. But he will be honored as the first casualty during the First World War. One of the real treasures that we have here at the museum, and I did not bring it out, is before he joined the service, he applied to become a U.S. citizen. And we have that record here. It's the only surviving document that Quansu Lee signed. But he was not able to complete that because he did not survive the war. David Rion, we have our first combat death here in Buffalo County. A great many of the photos of the soldiers, including this one, actually come out of the time capsule that was and remains in the gate at the Kearney Cemetery. So with the restoration of the gate, when the time capsule came out, the materials were digitized before they were put back in. And he passes away in combat. He's the first combat death in August of 1917, excuse me. One of the things that is very, very evident in the announcement of his death is the hope, it closes here, is the hope that he can be repatriated to Buffalo County eventually. The understanding he's buried in a military cemetery there in France, but he will be repatriated, and he is in the Kearney Cemetery, but his body would not be brought back until 1922. So you can imagine the long process, and this is very, very common. Gold Star mothers would go to France. There was a clearinghouse, there was a space that they would go to in Paris that had these enormous ledger books that they would go through looking for the cemetery where their child was, and then begin the process of trying to have the remains returned. And he is one of the few locally that was brought back. There are others who were not. We also have Dave Rion's young, Kwansu Lee is young. We also have older participants. Junius Boyle is an officer. He'd served in the Spanish-American War, and he comes from a very distinguished military family here in Kearney. His father, Julius Boyle, is probably the most famous Confederate veteran in Buffalo County, and built a very large plantation home next to Lake Kearney. Julius's father, so Junius's grandfather, was one of the commanders of a ship with Commodore Perry when they opened up Japan. So had a very distinguished lineage of military service, and his mother still lived in Kearney when he was in his 40s when he passed away. And one of the things that is evident in the Hub description of it is that the writer, as he says, the writer has known Junius Boyle ever since he was a young boy, and a more beautiful and admirable character she has never known. And so kind of describes this person, and where Julius Boyle is buried, we can mark his grave with a suitable monument. His epitaph should be, he devoted his life to his family and sacrificed for his country, which is among the accounts of combat deaths from the First World War in Buffalo County. This is the most personal. More often than not, it's just fairly flat description of what happened, what is known, but this one has this kind of editorial aside. And Junius is not buried in Kearney, ultimately. We also have, this is, as I mentioned, there's cases where we are sharing veterans with other counties. This is Roy Eaton. He's claimed as the first Scottsbluff County boy to die in combat in France, but he's also listed among the 22 war dead here in Buffalo County. And so this is actually a clipping from the announcement of his death from the time capsule at the Kearney Cemetery, and then this is from the paper in Minutair, actually, in Scottsbluff County. Roy spent part of his childhood in Buffalo County. It's unclear exactly what years, we don't quite have that information, but he is claimed by both of us. Yeah.
He happens to be my husband's great uncle, and he spent a lot of time in Buffalo County. Just before he joined this, he was up by Scottsbluff. He wasn't up there too long.
Well, now we know. Thank you. Thank you. And then Clarence Olson, this is the only UNK student who died in combat. This is also a photo of Clarence from the time capsule at the cemetery. Clarence, not from Kearney, but attended UNK and was the editor of the school paper, The Antelope. And ever the reporter, he would send letters to The Antelope. Clarence Olson writes from France, and describing everything. And this is in December of 1918. He loses 2 legs to shrapnel in the trenches, and is writing letters to The Antelope from his hospital bed in France. The tragic aspect of this, more tragic, when these letters are published, it's not known yet that he has already passed away. And so the students at UNK don't know that, again, because of the kind of delay as information is coming from the front. And so there's actually 3 letters here. His mother is able to dictate. I believe she's able to get to the hospital and is actually dictating some of the letters. And so there's quite a lot of bit about Clarence in the local paper, in the school paper, and the university really feels particularly distraught at his loss, because he had been so involved on campus and was kind of known to everyone. But for every soldier who died in combat, there were half a dozen soldiers who died in accidents during training, or different types of illnesses. And so this is Marvin Larimer, and this is also from the time capsule at the cemetery. And he dies of pneumonia at training camp. So a great many soldiers, again, you're crowded together and bringing all sorts of different germs and things together. But nevertheless, these men, even though they never made it to the front, were still honored by the local community and counted among those who had died in the service. And we see other accounts. So this is Bradley Buck, the announcement of his death. He is the first casualty in Gibbon. This is Bradley here. Kevin brought this from the Gibbon Heritage Center, and is the namesake of the Legion Hall or the Legion Post in Gibbon. But he dies in San Antonio. He's 25, and he passes away. It's meningitis, spinal meningitis, which is not. Horatio Hendricks, this is also from the time capsule in the cemetery. He dies of Spanish influenza. He's one of the Buffalo County soldiers who's actually in the Navy. Does not make it to France. And so we also see that into the fall of 1918 as the Spanish flu working its way through a great many of the camps and the training facilities, and even on troop transport ships, and affecting soldiers. We also see that the community is not only mourning the local men, but we also have evidence that others in Nebraska are being mourned locally. This artifact also comes from the time capsule at the cemetery, but neither of these men are from Kearney. They're both from Callaway. The one to the right, and this is typewritten on it folds open. The one on the right is Van Augustus, wounded in Gascon, France, died October 5th, 1918, home Callaway, Nebraska. The one on the left is Fred Sadler, Company L, 4th Nebraska, killed in action, October 5th, 1918, in France. So we can assume, based on this, they were together. When they passed, they both die on October 5th, 1918. And we don't know who put this photo in the time capsule at the cemetery. But presumably it's a family member who lives here in Callaway, a friend, maybe a fellow combatant. But it's evident these two young men, I mean, they knew each other. This is probably before they went off into the service together. And when folks come back, I want to take you through a really weird local World War I story. This is kind of the continued impact of the war. This is Ray's Strand. This is Ray's tombstone in the Kearney Cemetery. Can anybody tell me why this tombstone looks weird?
Well, it's Canadian.
It's Canadian. Good job. Yeah, it's Canadian. It's in and amongst the other veterans right when you come into the Kearney Cemetery, but it's got a maple leaf right here. He's a member of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. He's from Valentine, though. But he's in the Canadian Army. And he passes away in Kearney. He's from Valentine. He also has a couple of addresses in Omaha. But he's in a Manitoba unit. He enlists in Winnipeg. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this story. Why is he buried in Kearney? Why is he in the Canadian Army? There were a lot of questions raised about his service at the time as well. When he returned from the war and moved to Omaha, the Omaha News ran a full expose that he was lying about his service. And he sued the Omaha Daily News for $25,000. He's described here, he's the hero of a great many of the famous battles, the Somme and Vimy Ridge, among others, that he was gassed, he was wounded, he had part of his lung removed, that he really was this incredible Canadian hero. So why is he buried in Kearney? Why is this Canadian war hero buried in Kearney? The Canadians, in the United States, the Federal Archives repository containing most of the World War I records had a near catastrophic fire in the 70s. So personal records from the First World War are exceedingly infuriatingly difficult to kind of track down across the federal system because of the St. Louis fire. Whereas Canadian war records are all digitized and online and fairly easy to get a hold of. So I pulled Roy's file. He did not lose a lung. He was not in combat. He never left England. His big war wound was that he fell off a trolley in Winnipeg. Fell off a streetcar while returning to barracks at night in Winnipeg, was sent to hospital in Winnipeg with both clavicles on January 30th, 1917. Ever since injury was received, movements of arms, especially the right, have been limited. So not the story of losing a lung, getting gassed, everything. It's you fell off a streetcar at night. Okay, you're returning from the barracks. Okay, what were you maybe a little loose? And then he had 2 large calluses over the fractures due to improper healing, which limits the movements of arms and prevents him from carrying a pack and also from lifting any weight. So he enlists in 1916. He's actually also spent 8 years in the United States Navy. So he is a veteran. More likely than not, it's not clear from the Canadian records, but more likely than not, the Spanish-American War. Goes to Winnipeg and enlists, which is not uncommon. A lot of young men who want to participate in the war effort before the United States declares war do actually go through the Canadian service. So this is hardly unprecedented. But it is unprecedented that you would claim quite a significant story. And then we kind of lose track of him. It's unclear what happens with his court case, but we do know why he ended up in Kearney. This is also from his personnel file. This is also telling us about kind of the continued injuries that soldiers received. This is giving an update on his address, his latest address, care of Dr. Sidwell, State of Nebraska Hospital, tuberculosis, Kearney, Nebraska. Strangely enough, this is actually one of the better documented patients we have for the State Tuberculosis Hospital, because patient records from this time period do not survive. I mean, even if they did, legally it's annoying to get them. But he died at the tuberculosis hospital. And the Canadian government determined that he developed tuberculosis due to his wartime industries, or his wartime injuries, which is why he has a Canadian tombstone that the Canadian government actually paid for. But what we see in his story, right, is both continued illnesses, right, almost assuredly. The documentation tells us that he never left England. He was never in the trenches. Kind of reading between the lines and reading through some of the stuff, he worked as a lumberjack in Scotland, cutting timber for use on the front, you know, for trenches and different kinds of things. He marries a Scottish woman, we do know this, but doesn't actually leave Europe, and more likely than not, the strain and things do contribute to his tuberculosis and ultimately his death. And why he is claiming some stolen valor, unclear. Could be mental illness, could be he's a little bit of a narcissist, we don't know from the surviving materials. But the war will continue to have lasting impacts on folks. Now, speaker's privilege, so we're going to deviate just a little bit over to Dawson County because I want to kind of talk about those lasting impacts. A lot of men who come back, the war will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And it will be something that will continue to shape a great many things. So this gentleman here, this is George Block. And then right here, and this is George's uniform, actually from both of those photos. He's a private in the Vet Corps, and very, very skinny. I cannot fit in it, I've tried. This is my great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather was the son of German immigrants in Dawson County, farmers. There's still a ton of blocks in Dawson County. I'm related to all of them. And George's father told his sons, there were 13 children, most of them boys, told the boys that one of you has to go serve. to prove that we're American. They still spoke German at home. They were very proudly Lutheran. And we actually have it in and amongst the World War I records. My his father, bought a German war bond to support the Kaiser in like 1914. So we know that there were some early issues with allegiances, but this changes in 1718, and this is also not uncommon among the German population. So all the boys are brought together, as the story goes, and they draw straws. And my grandfather gets the short straw. And so he has to go serve. And he departs for training in Des Moines in 1917. And is asked as part of his training if anybody knows anything about horses. And he's like, yeah, I'm a farm kid from Nebraska. I know everything you need to know about horses. And so he joins the vet corps. The rest of the men who he was drafted with are sent to the front, and a great many of them do not survive. He then goes to the vet corps and thankfully contracts the Spanish flu, which sidelines him. And so by the time he finally gets to France, and I have his diary and everything that he has from France, including his dog tags, he gets to France on November 8th, 1918. So he's only in France for 3 days before the war is over, which will greatly impact the rest of his life. He then he's part of the occupying force in 1819 and spends his time selling horses to French farmers and French abattoirs, which is the word for horse butcher, if you didn't know what an abattoir was. Spending time, he travels around France, and it's an incredible opportunity for a young farm kid from Dawson County. But he gets back, and because he did not serve in combat, and because he was only technically in the war for 3 days, he had been promised when drawing the lots, this has been part of the conversation, is that he would receive a greater portion of the family farm when he came back, if he survived. And his dad said, you didn't do anything over there. You're not getting it. And so he remained a tenant farmer for the rest of his life. He never got a part of the family farm. It caused such a rift in the family. But he was so proud of his service. He passed away in the mid-1970s. Was so proud of his service, even though he was only there technically for 3 days during the war, but spends through 1919 in France. He had a framed photo of his troop transport ship in his house in Cozad. He had the framed photo of Camp Dodge in his house. He had a framed photo of all of the men he had been drafted with, all of which now are in my study at home. But would continue to be very, very proud of his time, but because of that, was not able to have the economic success that he had hoped for. He was always farming somebody else's land because of his service in the First World War. But still very proud of it. Continued to, shortly after he died, somebody in my family had his uniform dry cleaned. And so it's in incredibly good condition for as old as it is. But a great many soldiers like George Block, like the other two who came back from the war in Buffalo County, continued to carry the war with them until they died. And assuredly, some of you in this room knew World War I veterans. We haven't had a World War I veteran since 1910 in the United States, but within your lifetimes, assuredly you knew some of these men who had been to France, who could hum to you over there, who could maybe remember the smell of mustard gas, or at least the sound of the whistle when you would have to go over the top. And I want to close with this. I haven't even gotten to the title of the talk, and I want to close with that. That experience of the First World War was very impactful on the state of Nebraska. And so Willa Cather's novel, One of Ours, which she received the Pulitzer Prize for in 1923, is about her cousin Claude from Bladen, who died in combat in the First World War. And she would go to France, and she would go and locate his grave and send a map of the cemetery back to her aunt. But this is the scene where she describes her cousin dying, which is modeled partially on, she was actually able to read his letters and learn a lot about what he did The blood dripped down from his coat, but he felt no weakness. He felt only one thing, that he commanded wonderful men. When David came up with the supports, he might find them dead, but he would find them all there. They were there to stay until they were carried out to be buried. They were mortal, but they were unconquerable. And this is kind of how she closes. She closes the novel. And so that's just what I want to leave you at, with some thoughts as we approach Veterans Day. So thank you.